and to take someone into the circle to make them family when blood does not. He looked down at her, and Clara saw something fierce and protective in his expression. You are Hoka now, you and your boys. The circle protects what belongs to it. As they rode away from the place where Clara Whitfield had died and been reborn, the desert wind caught the torn canvas of the abandoned wagon, sending it fluttering like a flag of surrender. Behind them, their tracks were already being erased by the shifting sand, as if the desert itself wanted to help them disappear. Clara closed her eyes and felt the rhythm of the horse beneath her, the steady heartbeat of the man who had chosen to save her, the soft breathing of her sons against her chest. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that somewhere ahead lay not just survival, but the possibility of something she'd thought lost forever home. The sun climbed higher, but its heat no longer felt like an enemy. Instead, it warmed her back as they rode north toward mountains that rose like promises against the endless sky, toward a people who might teach her that family was not just about blood, but about the choices we make when the darkness falls, and we must decide who we're willing to say. Dave. The paint mare's hooves struck a steady rhythm against the hard pan earth as they climbed into the foothills, each step carrying them further from the brutal sun of the desert floor and closer to something Clara couldn't yet name. Behind Chetan's solid presence, she felt the babies stirring against her chest, their tiny mouths working against her skin with an instinct older than memory. The bleeding had slowed to a manageable flow thanks to the herbs he'd applied in the darkness, but she could feel her body's desperate need for real rest, real healing. How much further? She whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that swept down from the rocky peaks ahead. Before dark. Chetan replied, his arm tightening slightly around her waist as the mare navigated a particularly steep section of trail. My grandmother, she will know what to do. Clara nodded, trying to ignore the way her vision kept blurring at the edges. The babies were so quiet now, too quiet, and she pressed her ear to each tiny chest, in turn reassuring herself that their hearts still beat with fierce determination. Ethan's breathing was deeper, more regular, but Jonah felt fragile as spun glass in her arms. The landscape changed gradually as they climbed the harsh alkali, giving way to scrub pine and juniper, then to stands of aspen whose leaves whispered secrets in the mountain breeze. Clara had never seen country like this, wild and untamed, in a way that made her Missouri farmland seem tame as a garden. Here she felt as if they were riding through the very bones of the earth, exposed and ancient and beautiful beyond description. As the afternoon wore on, she became aware of other sounds joining the rhythm of their passage. The distant call of an eagle, overhead the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, and something else, something that made Chetan suddenly pull the mare to a halt. What is it? Clara asked, but he was already turning his head, listening with the intensity of a predator sensing prey. The sound came again, clearer now, the rhythmic beat of unshod horses, approaching fast from behind them. Chetan's body went rigid against her back, and she felt him reach for something at his belt. Riders, he said tersely, coming hard. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she thought of Silas, of Elyseus, and the other men who had abandoned her to die. Had they changed their minds, come back to finish what they'd started, or worse, had they discovered that someone had helped her? Can we outrun them? She asked. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew the answer. The mare was strong, but carrying double, and Clara was in no condition for a hard chase through mountain terrain. Chetan was already moving, guiding the horse off the main trail and into a stand of granite boulders that offered some concealment. The rocks formed a natural shelter hidden from the trail, but accessible to anyone who knew where to look. He dismounted quickly and helped Clara down, supporting her weight as her legs threatened to buckle. Stay here, he said, pressing a knife into her hand, a wicked-looking blade with a bone handle worn smooth by years of use. If they find you... No, Clara said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. Whatever happens, we face it together. I won't let you die for us and then die anyway. Chatan looked at her for a long moment, something like respect flickering in his dark eyes. Then he nodded once, a sharp acknowledgement that spoke of decisions made and accepted. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Clara pressed herself against the cool stone, holding the babies close to her chest. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see the trail, clearly could watch for the moment when their pursuers would either pass by or discover their hiding place. 3 riders appeared around a bend in the trail, their horses lathered with sweat and foam. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she recognized Ellis's weathered face. Beneath his broad-brimmed hat, his pale eyes scanning the landscape with the intensity of a man tracking wounded prey. Beside him rode 2 other men she didn't recognize, hard-faced strangers with the look of hired guns about them. They pulled up almost directly opposite the boulder field, and Clara felt Chatan tense beside her, his hand moving to the tomahawk at his belt. Ellis dismounted and walked to the edge of the trail, studying the ground with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years reading sign in difficult country. "Tracks end here," he called to his companions. 2 horses, 1 carrying double. One of the strangers, a thin man with a scraggly beard, spat into the dust. "Maybe they went up into them rocks." "Maybe," Ellis agreed, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Or maybe they're smart enough to know we'd think that." Clara held her breath as Ellis walked closer to their hiding place, his boots crunching on the loose stone. Behind her, she could feel Chatan's readiness, could sense the violence coiled in his muscles, like a spring wound too tight. If Ellis found them, blood would spill on these ancient rocks, and she had no doubt whose blood it would be. "Don't matter anyway," the 3rd man said, a heavy-set rider with arms like tree trunks. "Old man Whitfield just wants to know she's dead. Don't much care how it happens." Ellis paused in his examination of the rocks, his head tilting as if he'd heard something. Clara pressed her hand over Jonah's mouth, terrified that even the sound of his breathing might give them away. The knife Chatan had given her felt impossibly heavy in her other hand, its weight a reminder of just how far she'd traveled from the woman who'd left Missouri with dreams of California orange groves. "She's dead," Ellis said finally, his voice flat with certainty. "Woman like that, city-bred and soft. She wouldn't last a day in this country without help, and ain't nobody out here gonna help a white woman." "If only you knew," Clara thought, glancing sideways at Chatan's profile, etched in stone and shadow against the granite. "The babies, too?" the bearded man asked. "Especially the babies." Ellis remounted his horse with the fluid motion of someone who'd spent more time in the saddle than on his feet. "Desert don't care if you're 3 minutes old or 30 years. Takes 'em all the same." They rode on, their voices fading into the distance, but Chatan made Clara wait another hour before emerging from their hiding place. When they finally continued up the trail, she felt as if she'd aged years in those few minutes among the rocks. The casual way Ellis had discussed her death, the certainty in his voice that she and her babies were already corpses, it crystallized something inside her, hardened her resolve in a way that mere survival never could. "He was wrong," she said quietly as they rode deeper into the mountains. "About what?" Chatan asked. "About nobody helping a white woman out here." She turned slightly in the saddle to look at him. "You helped us." "You are not white woman now," Chatan replied matter-of-factly. "You are mother of twin sons saved by the desert spirits. Color of skin matters less than color of heart." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Clara caught her first glimpse of Chatan's people. The village appeared gradually emerging from the landscape as if it had grown there, naturally hide lodges arranged in a careful pattern among the pines, horses grazing in a natural meadow, children's laughter echoing off the surrounding cliffs. Smoke rose from cooking fires carrying the scent of roasting meat and unfamiliar herbs that made Clara's empty stomach clench with hunger. The first person to notice their approach was a young girl, perhaps 12 years old, who looked up from where she was gathering firewood and froze at the sight of Clara's pale skin and torn dress. The girl's eyes went wide and she dropped her bundle of sticks before running toward the village, calling out in rapid Sioux that Clara couldn't understand, but whose urgency was unmistakable. By the time they reached the outskirts of the village, a small crowd had gathered. Clara felt their eyes on her, saw the mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and outright hostility in some faces. An older man with gray braids and a face like weathered leather stepped forward, speaking sharply to Chatan in their own language. The conversation that followed was rapid and heated, with gestures toward Clara and the babies that left no doubt about the subject under discussion. "They're arguing about us," Clara said quietly. "Yes," Chatan admitted. "Some think bringing white woman here is dangerous. We'll bring soldiers." Clara's heart sank as she realized she might have traded one death sentence for another. These people had their own struggles, their own reasons to fear discovery by the outside world. Taking in a white woman and her babies could be seen as an act of war by the territorial authorities. The argument was interrupted by a voice that cut through the debate like a blade through silk. An old woman's voice speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The crowd parted, and Clara found herself looking at perhaps the most remarkable person she'd ever seen. The woman who approached was ancient, her face mapped with lines that spoke of decades spent under the open sky, but her eyes were sharp as obsidian and missed nothing. She wore a dress of soft doeskin decorated with intricate beadwork, and around her neck hung amulets and medicine bags that seemed to contain the very essence of the wild places. Her gray hair was braided with feathers and small bones, and when she moved, Clara could swear she heard the whisper of wind through canyon walls. This could only be Chatan's grandmother, the medicine woman he'd spoken of with such reverence. Clara felt those ancient eyes studying her, taking in every detail of her appearance, her condition, the babies she held. The examination seemed to last forever, and Clara had the distinct impression that this woman could see straight through to her soul. Finally, the old woman spoke, her voice carrying easily across the silent gathering. She spoke in Sioux, but her tone was unmistakable, a command that brooked no argument. The crowd began to disperse, though Clara noticed that some of the men continued to watch her, with expressions that ranged from wary to openly hostile. "What did she say?" Clara asked as Chatan helped her down from the horse. "She said you are under her protection now," he replied. "She said the spirits sent you to us for a reason, and it is not for us to question the spirits' wisdom." The old woman approached, moving with surprising grace for someone of her obvious age. When she reached Clara, she gently touched each baby's forehead with fingers that felt warm as summer stones, murmuring something under her breath that sounded like a blessing. "I am a pony," she said, in careful English, her accent thick but her words clear. "It means butterfly in your language, and these," she gestured at the babies, "these are gifts from the spirit world. I see it in their faces." Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes at the simple kindness in the old woman's voice. "I'm Clara. This is Ethan and Jonah. I don't know how to thank you for—" "No thanks needed," a pony interrupted gently. "The spirits provide for those they choose to protect. Come, you need food, rest, healing. Babies need milk and warmth." She led Clara toward one of the larger lodges, speaking rapidly to a young woman who had been hovering nearby. The girl, for she couldn't have been more than 16, had a gentle face and eyes full of sympathy. She disappeared into the lodge and emerged moments later with an armload of soft furs and blankets. "This is Camila," a pony explained as they reached the lodge entrance. "She will help with babies while I tend to your injuries. She has milk to spare. Her own baby was born 2 moons ago." Clara felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly knocked her over. The thought that her babies might actually survive, might thrive, seemed too miraculous to believe. She allowed herself to be led into the dim, warm interior of the lodge, where the walls were decorated with painted symbols and the air smelled of sage and sweet grass. Camilla took Jonah from Clara's arms with the practiced ease of a young mother cooing to him in Sioux as she settled him against her breast. The baby latched on immediately, his tiny fists working against her dark skin as he fed with desperate hunger. Clara watched, overwhelmed by gratitude for this stranger who was willing to nourish her child as if he were her own. "Now you," Aponi said firmly, helping Clara to lie down on a bed of soft furs. "I must see how much damage the birth has done." What followed was unlike any medical examination Clara had ever experienced. Aponi's hands moved over her body with the sureness of someone who had delivered hundreds of babies. But her touch carried something more, a warmth that seemed to flow directly from her fingertips into Clara's damaged flesh. She used herbs Clara had never seen before, creating poultices and teas with ingredients that seemed to have been gathered from every corner of the natural world. As Aponi worked, she spoke in a mixture of English and Sioux, sometimes to Clara, sometimes to Camilla, and sometimes to spirits only she could see. Clara found herself drifting in and out of consciousness, lulled by the rhythmic sound of the old woman's voice and the crackling of the fire at the center of the lodge. When she woke, it was full dark outside, and the lodge was lit only by the gentle glow of the fire. Camilla sat nearby, both babies sleeping peacefully in her arms, their bellies round with milk and their faces peaceful in the firelight. Clara tried to sit up and was amazed to discover that the constant burning pain in her lower body had diminished to a dull ache. "You heal quickly," Aponi observed from where she sat, grinding something in a stone bowl. "The spirits favor you." "I don't understand," Clara said softly. "Why are you helping us, your people and mine? We're not exactly friends." Aponi's hands stilled for a moment, and when she looked up, Clara saw something ancient and infinitely sad in her eyes. "Long ago," the old woman said slowly, "before the wagon people came, before the horse soldiers, there was just the land and those who lived with it in harmony. Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, different peoples, but all understanding that the earth provides for all her children." She resumed her grinding the stone, making a soft scraping sound against stone. "Then came the Wasichu, the white men with their hunger for gold and land and things that cannot be owned. They brought division where there had been cooperation, war where there had been peace." Clara listened, feeling the weight of history in the old woman's words, the accumulated grief of a people watching their world disappear. "But sometimes," Aponi continued, "the spirits remind us of what was lost. They send us a white woman who births her children in the desert alone and abandoned by her own people. They send us babies who need our milk to survive. This is not accident. This is teaching." "Teaching what?" Clara asked. "That underneath skin, underneath language, underneath the divisions men make, underneath all of that, we are same. Mothers who love children, people who help those in need, spirits who recognize other spirits." Camilla looked up from the sleeping babies, her young face serious in the firelight. "Aponi speaks truth," she said in halting English. "When soldiers came to our old village, white woman there, missionary's wife. She try to help, try to stop killing. Soldiers shoot her same as they shoot us. Her skin not save her when she choose to stand with us." Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a understanding that went deeper than words. These people had every reason to hate her, to see her as a symbol of everything that threatened their way of life. Instead, they had chosen to see her as what she was, a mother in desperate need, a woman who had been cast out by her own people as surely as they had been driven from their homes by hers. "I want to learn," Clara said quietly. "I want to understand your ways, your language. I want my sons to know both worlds they come from." Aponi smiled for the first time since Clara had met her, and the expression transformed her weathered face into something beautiful and timeless. "Good," she said. "Tomorrow, when you are stronger, learning begins. But tonight, rest. Tomorrow brings enough troubles of its own." As if summoned by her words, a commotion erupted outside the lodge, the sound of horses approaching fast, and men's voices calling out in alarm. Chatan's voice rose above the others, sharp with urgency, and Clara felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized the danger in his tone. Aponi was already moving, gathering up her medicine bags and securing the more valuable items in the lodge. Camilla clutched the babies closer, her eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" Clara asked, though part of her already knew. "Soldiers," Aponi said grimly. "The blue coats have found us." Through the lodge walls, Clara could hear the ordered chaos of a camp, preparing for possible battle, women calling to children, men checking weapons, horses being moved to more defensible positions. She struggled to sit up, ignoring the pain that shot through her body. "This is my fault," she said. "If I hadn't come here, if spirits had not sent you here, soldiers would still come." Aponi interrupted firmly. "They always come eventually. Is their way." Chatan appeared in the lodge entrance, his face grim in the firelight. 20 riders, he reported tersely, moving fast from the south. They will be here within the hour. "Do they know about Clara?" Camilla asked, switching to English so Clara could understand. "Unknown," Chatan replied, "but if they find white woman here." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Clara understood the implications all too well. Her presence could be seen as evidence that the tribe had been raiding white settlements, kidnapping women and children. It would justify any atrocity the soldiers chose to commit. "I have to go," Clara said, trying to stand. "I have to take the babies and—" "Go where?" Chatan asked harshly. "You cannot ride, cannot walk far. Babies need constant care. Desert will kill you all before sunrise." Clara sank back onto the furs, feeling trapped between impossible choices. Stay and bring destruction down on the people who had saved her life, or leave and watch her children die in the wilderness. "There is another way," Aponi said quietly. She moved to a leather trunk at the back of the lodge and began pulling out items Clara couldn't identify in the dim light. "We make you invisible." "What do you mean?" Clara asked. "We make you Lakota," Aponi replied simply. "Soldiers see what they expect to see. They expect to find savage Indians, maybe white captive. They do not expect to find Lakota woman with Lakota babies." Clara's mind reeled as she understood what the old woman was proposing. "You want to disguise me." "Not disguise," Aponi corrected. "Transform. For tonight Clara Whitfield does not exist. Tonight you are Wakanhin Najin woman who prays standing, mother of twin boys born under the desert stars." Camilla was already moving, bringing out paints and brushes made from animal hair. "We must hurry," she said urgently. "Not much time." What followed was perhaps the most surreal experience of Clara's life. Under Aponi's expert hands, her pale skin was darkened with walnut stain and ochre paint, her tangled brown hair braided with feathers and beads in the Lakota style. They dressed her in a soft doe-skin dress, decorated with intricate quill work, replacing her torn and bloody pioneer clothing with the regalia of a woman of the plains. The transformation was more than cosmetic as Aponi worked. She whispered instructions in Clara's ear, teaching her how to hold herself, how to move, how to breathe like a woman who belonged to this world. When they were finished, Clara hardly recognized herself in the polished metal mirror Camilla held up. "Remember," Aponi said as the sound of approaching horses grew louder. "You understand no English. You speak only Lakota. Camilla will translate if needed. And whatever happens, do not let them see fear in your eyes. Lakota women are not afraid of blue coats." Clara nodded, trying to absorb the crash course in cultural survival they'd just given her. Outside, she could hear Shaitan and the other men of the village taking positions, their voices low and tense. The sound of children crying drifted from other lodges, quickly muffled by mothers who understood that silence might mean the difference between life and death. The soldiers arrived like a thunderstorm, their horses' hooves pounding against the earth with the rhythm of war drums. Clara could hear their leader barking orders, could hear the jingle of harnesses and the creak of leather as they deployed around the village. Through the lodge entrance, she caught glimpses of blue uniforms and brass buttons, catching the moonlight of rifles held ready and eyes that missed nothing. The commanding officer's voice cut through the night air like a saber, harsh with authority and suspicion. By order of the territorial government, this camp is under military investigation. We're looking for a white woman and 2 infants possibly taken captive during an attack on a wagon train. Anyone harboring fugitives or stolen property will be considered in violation of federal law. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the lie that was being told. In the official version of events, she hadn't been abandoned to die. She'd been kidnapped, her babies stolen away by hostile Indians. It was a story that would justify any action the military chose to take, would turn her rescue into a crime punishable by death. Heavy footsteps approached their lodge, and Clara clutched the babies closer, praying they would remain silent. Kimila moved to sit beside her, her presence a comfort in the growing darkness of their situation. The lodge flap was swept aside without ceremony, and a figure in blue stepped into the firelight, a young lieutenant with pale eyes and a jaw set in lines of determined duty. Behind him loomed a sergeant with the weathered face of a career soldier, his hand resting casually on the butt of his sidearm. Clara forced herself to look up at them with the blank incomprehension of someone who spoke no English, while inside her mind screamed warnings, and her every instinct told her to run. The lieutenant's gaze swept over the lodge, taking in every detail before settling on Clara and the babies in her arms. For a long, terrible moment, their eyes met across the flames, and Clara felt as if he could see straight through a pony's careful transformation to the white woman hiding beneath. The silence stretched between them like a bowstring, drawn too tight, ready to snap and send everything spinning into chaos. Then Kimila spoke, her voice steady and carefully neutral, as she addressed the soldiers in English, playing her role as translator with an actress's skill. "This woman asks what you seek in our lodge," Kimila said carefully, her English deliberately stilted to suggest translation. "She says her babies sleep and should not be disturbed by loud voices." The lieutenant stepped closer, his pale eyes studying Clara's face with uncomfortable intensity. She could smell the leather and horse sweat on his uniform, could see the dust of hard travel in the lines around his eyes. This was a man who had ridden far and fast, driven by orders that brooked no delay. "Tell her we're looking for a white woman," he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "About her age, with brown hair. She would have had 2 newborn babies with her." Clara felt sweat gathering beneath the walnut stain on her forehead as Kimila translated the question into rapid Sioux. She forced herself to respond with the confused shrug of someone hearing about strangers for the first time, shaking her head and murmuring words a pony had coached her to use. "She says she knows nothing of white women," Kimila reported. "She says this is peaceful village. We trouble no one." The sergeant stepped forward, his weathered face skeptical. "Lieutenant, these babies look mighty young. When were they born?" Clara's blood turned to ice as she realized the trap closing around them. Ethan and Jonah were obviously newborns, their skin still wrinkled and their movements uncoordinated. Any experienced soldier would know that timing was everything in a case like this. Kimila translated the question, and Clara responded with what she hoped sounded like a mother's pride, gesturing at the babies and speaking in the few Lakota phrases she'd managed to memorize. She pointed toward the moon visible through the smoke hole above, holding up fingers to indicate days. "She says her sons were born 3 nights ago," Kimila translated. When the moon was dark, the spirits blessed her with twins. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed, and Clara could see him doing the mathematics in his head, trying to determine if the timeline matched whatever intelligence had brought him here. She held her breath, knowing that her life and the lives of everyone in the village might depend on his calculation. 3 nights ago, he repeated slowly. That would put it right around the time of the attack on the Whitfield woman. Clara's heart nearly stopped at the mention of her married name, but she forced herself to maintain the blank expression of someone who understood nothing. Inside, her mind raced with the implications of what she'd just heard. Silas had reported her as attacked, not abandoned. He'd turned her rescue into a crime, her salvation into evidence of Indian aggression. Ask her about the father, the sergeant said, his hand moving closer to his weapon. Where's her husband? Before Camilla could translate, Chatan appeared in the lodge entrance, his presence filling the small space with barely contained tension. Clara saw the soldiers' hands move instinctively toward their guns, saw the way they positioned themselves between him and the exit. I am husband, Chatan said in careful English, his accent thick but his meaning clear. These are my sons. The lieutenant's gaze moved between Chatan and Clara, studying their faces for any sign of deception. Clara forced herself to look at Chatan with what she hoped passed for wifely affection, while inside she marveled at his willingness to claim her children as his own. In the eyes of the law, what he was doing constituted marriage to a white woman, a crime that could cost him his life in some territories. Your sons, the lieutenant repeated, and you're certain they're yours. Something dangerous flashed in Chatan's eyes at the insult implied in the question, but his voice remained steady. I know my own blood. The sergeant moved closer to Clara, studying the babies with the clinical detachment of a man following orders. Funny thing, he said conversationally. The woman we're looking for, she was pregnant with twins, due to deliver right around now. Clara felt the walls of the lodge closing in around her as the sergeant reached out toward Ethan, clearly intending to examine him more closely. Without thinking, she pulled her sons closer to her chest and spoke sharply in what she hoped sounded like protective Lakota. She says, do not touch her babies, Camilla translated quickly. She says white man's hands carry bad medicine. The sergeant's eyes hardened at the perceived insult, but before he could respond, a pony swept into the lodge with the authority of a woman accustomed to being obeyed. She spoke rapidly in Sioux, her voice carrying the edge of command, and Clara caught enough words to understand that she was asserting her rights as a medicine woman and elder. The grandmother says these are sacred children, Camilla translated, her voice carefully respectful. Born during the dark moon, blessed by spirits. She says touching them without ceremony would bring bad luck to your soldiers. The lieutenant looked frustrated, clearly caught between his orders and the cultural complexities of the situation. Clara could see him weighing his options, trying to decide how far he could push without starting a fight he might not be able to finish. We have reports that this band has been raiding supply trains, he said finally, attacking settlers, taking captives. Reports from who? Chatan asked, his voice deceptively calm. Reliable sources, the lieutenant replied evasively. Men who know this territory. Clara felt sick as she realized what was happening. Silas had found a way to use her disappearance to justify military action against the very people who had saved her life. By claiming she'd been kidnapped rather than abandoned, he'd provided the army with exactly the pretext they needed to attack this peaceful village. We're going to need to search the entire camp, the sergeant announced. Check every lodge, every hiding place. For what purpose? A pony asked, through Camilla's translation, her ancient eyes blazing with controlled fury. Looking for stolen property, captives, evidence of raids. The old medicine woman drew herself up to her full height, and despite her small stature, she seemed to fill the lodge with her presence. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of generations, the accumulated authority of a people who had walked this land since time began. You come to our home with guns and accusations." Camilla translated, her voice growing stronger as she conveyed Aponi's words. "You seek to take what little we have left, to drive us from the last place where our children can sleep safely. What proof do you bring of these crimes you speak of?" The lieutenant shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to being challenged by an elderly Indian woman. "We don't need proof to conduct a lawful search." "Lawful according to whose law?" Chetan interrupted, his English suddenly much clearer and more precise than he'd let on. "The law that says this land belongs to us by treaty. The law that promises we will not be molested as long as we remain peaceful, or the law that changes whenever white men want something we have." Clara watched the exchange with growing alarm, recognizing the signs of a confrontation spiraling beyond anyone's control. The soldiers were outnumbered here, but they had the backing of the territorial government and the threat of reinforcements. The villagers had the advantage of terrain and desperation, but challenging federal authority directly could bring down the full weight of the army. In her arms, Jonah began to stir, making the soft mewing sounds that preceded a full-scale crying fit. Clara rocked him gently, trying to keep him quiet, but his brother was beginning to wake as well. Soon both babies would be demanding attention, and she wasn't sure her disguise would hold up under that kind of scrutiny. "Lieutenant," the sergeant said quietly, "we should finish this search quickly. Don't like the way some of these bucks are looking at us." Through the lodge entrance, Clara could see that a crowd had gathered, men with rifles, women with knives, even children old enough to understand that strangers with guns meant danger. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and she realized that one wrong word, one misunderstood gesture could turn this tense standoff into a massacre. The lieutenant seemed to reach the same conclusion. 5 minutes, he told the sergeant. "Quick sweep, then we move on to the next camp." As the soldiers prepared to leave the lodge, Clara felt a moment of hope that they might actually escape detection. But then the sergeant paused at the entrance, his experienced eyes taking one last look around the space. "Funny thing about that woman we're tracking," he said conversationally. "She had a distinctive birthmark on her left shoulder, about the size of a silver dollar shaped like a crescent moon." Clara's blood turned to ice as she realized the trap. Somehow Silas had provided the army with intimate details about her appearance, details that only a family member would know. The sergeant was studying her carefully now, looking for any sign of that telltale mark. "Course, if this is really an Indian woman," he continued, "she wouldn't have any such mark, would she?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Clara felt every eye in the lodge focused on her, felt the weight of multiple lives hanging in the balance. If she revealed the birthmark, it would confirm their suspicions and likely doom the entire village. If she refused to cooperate, the soldiers might take more direct action to verify her identity. It was Aponi who broke the deadlock, speaking rapidly in Sioux, with the tone of someone explaining obvious facts to slow children. Through Camilla's translation, her words carried the perfect mixture of indignation and cultural pride. "The grandmother says you ask to see sacred marks on a nursing mother's body," Camilla relayed. "She says this is great insult to our people. She says such marks are between woman and spirits only, not for white soldiers to see." "That's convenient," the sergeant said dryly. "You want to start war over this?" Chetan asked quietly, but his voice carried clearly to every person in the lodge. "You want to kill women and babies because old man's grief makes him see enemies where there are none." The lieutenant's face flushed at the accusation, but Clara could see uncertainty in his eyes. He was young, probably new to the territory, still learning the delicate balance between following orders and avoiding incidents that could destroy his career. "We're not here to start a war," he said finally. "We're here to recover stolen property and missing persons." "Then look elsewhere," Chetan replied firmly. "You see only what has always been here, families trying to live in peace." For a long moment the lodge was silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the soft sounds of the babies beginning to fuss. Clara could feel sweat running down her back beneath the doeskin dress, could taste fear like copper in her mouth. Every second that passed without discovery was a small miracle, but she knew their luck couldn't hold forever. The decision, when it came, surprised everyone. The lieutenant straightened his shoulders and nodded curtly to his sergeant. "We're done here," he said. "Search the rest of the camp, but quickly. I want to be back on the trail within the hour." As the soldiers filed out of the lodge, Clara felt her legs give way beneath her. Only Camilla's quick support kept her from collapsing entirely, and she clutched the babies to her chest, with hands that shook like aspen leaves in a storm. "It's not over," Chatan said quietly, watching through the entrance as the soldiers spread out through the village. "They will be back with more men and fewer questions." A pony moved to Clara's side, her weathered hands checking the babies with practiced efficiency. "The little ones are hungry," she observed. "Fear makes mother's milk thin. Camilla, feed them again while we plan." As the young woman took the babies and settled them against her breast, Clara found her voice again. "I have to leave," she said urgently. "I have to take them away from here before what?" A pony interrupted gently. "Before you die in the wilderness, before babies starve because you have no milk, before winter kills you all, before I bring the army down on your people." Clara finished desperately. "You heard them. They'll be back. Next time they might not be so easily fooled." "Next time we will be gone," Chatan said simply. "We plan to move north anyway before the snows come. This just means we leave sooner." Clara stared at him, understanding dawning slowly. "You're willing to abandon your home because of me." "This is not our home," a pony said patiently. "Home is where the people are, not the place. Places can be taken, burned, forbidden to us. But as long as the people survive, we carry home with us wherever we go." Outside, they could hear the soldiers conducting their search boots, tramping through the village, voices raised in authority, the occasional crash of something being overturned. But there were no shots fired, no screams of pain or fear. The lieutenant, whatever his flaws, seemed determined to keep this from escalating into violence. "There," Camilla said, softly looking up from the nursing babies, "both fed and content. Strong boys, they fight hard for what they need." Clara watched her sons, marveling at how peaceful they looked despite the chaos surrounding them. In the space of just a few days, they had been born in the desert, survived abandonment and exposure, found refuge among strangers, and now faced their first military raid. Yet they slept on, trusting in the arms that held them and the voices that spoke gently around them. "What do we do now?" Clara asked. "Now we wait," a pony replied. "Wait for soldiers to leave, wait for night to fall. Then we begin long journey north to winter camps in the Bighorn Mountains." "It will be hard travel," Chatan warned. "Many days through difficult country, with babies so young." "The babies will survive," a pony said with quiet certainty. "The spirits did not preserve them in the desert only to let them die in the mountains. And you," she looked directly at Clara, "you are stronger than you know. Desert taught you this, even if you do not understand the lesson yet." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation, and they all tensed as a shadow fell across the lodge entrance. But it was one of the village men, an older warrior with scars across his arms and a face like granite. "Soldiers leaving," he reported in English, clearly meant for Clara's benefit. "But they talk of coming back with more men, talk of permanent fort nearby to monitor Indian activity." Clara felt her heart sink at the news. She had hoped that passing the soldiers' inspection might buy them time, but it seemed her presence had only delayed the inevitable. By existing, by being rescued, by simply surviving, she had made these people targets. "How long before they return?" Chatan asked. "Days, maybe weeks," the warrior replied. "Depends on how many soldiers they can gather, how much importance their chiefs place on this matter." "Then we move tonight," a pony decided, "as soon as moon sets and darkness is deepest. Pack only what we can carry easily, everything else stays." As the evening wore on, Clara watched the village transform around her. What had seemed like a permanent settlement that morning became a temporary camp with families quickly and efficiently gathering their most precious possessions. Lodge poles were taken down, horses were loaded with supplies, and children who had been playing carefree games just hours before now helped with the serious business of survival. Clara tried to help where she could, but Camila and Aponi insisted she rest, conserving her strength for the journey ahead. She watched from inside the lodge as people she barely knew made decisions that would uproot their entire lives, all because she had stumbled into their world, carrying 2 babies and a burden of consequences she was only beginning to understand. "I'm sorry," she said quietly to Shaitan when he came to check on the preparations. "I'm sorry for all of this." He paused in his work, studying her face in the firelight. "You sorry for living, is sorry for saving your children's lives." "I'm sorry for the trouble it's brought you." "Trouble was coming anyway," he replied matter-of-factly. "White men want this land, want all land. Today, tomorrow, next year makes no difference. They would find excuse eventually. But not today. Today could have been peaceful." Shaitan was quiet for a moment, his hands still as he considered her words. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of experience that made him seem older than his years. "My father used to say that peace is like water, in cupped hands, precious necessary, but impossible to hold forever. What matters is not how long peace lasts, but what we do with it while it is ours." Clara thought about that as she watched him return to his preparations, understanding that she was witnessing something remarkable. These people faced with displacement and danger because of her presence had chosen not anger or resentment, but acceptance and adaptation. They were teaching her something about resilience that all her years of comfortable living had never shown her. As full darkness fell and the moon began its descent toward the western horizon, the village completed its transformation. What had been a thriving community that morning was now empty ground, marked only by fire circles and worn paths. The people had become shadows, moving with practiced silence through terrain they knew by heart. Clara found herself mounted again on Shaitan's paint mare, the babies secured against her chest, in a cradleboard that Camila had woven from willows and soft hide. The device was unlike anything she'd ever seen, designed to keep the twins safe and warm, while allowing her hands to remain free for riding. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly as the column began to move, following game trails that led north into increasingly rugged country. "To the high places," Aponi replied from where she rode nearby, "where the air is thin and the spirits speak clearly, where winter comes early but spring brings new hope. And after winter we see what world is left to us. Maybe the white chiefs will remember their promises of peace. Maybe your people will learn to share the earth instead of consuming it. Maybe babies will grow strong enough to choose their own paths between 2 worlds." Clara rode through the darkness holding her sons and trying to imagine the future Aponi described. Behind them, the abandoned village site grew smaller and more distant until it was nothing but a memory in the vast night. Ahead lay uncertainty, hardship, and the promise of survival earned through struggle. But for the first time since Thomas had died in that hotel room in Kansas City, Clara felt something she had thought lost forever: hope. Not the naive hope of a young bride dreaming of orange groves, but the harder, more precious hope of a woman who had been tested by fire and found herself stronger than she knew. The column moved steadily northward through the night, following ancient paths through a landscape that seemed to exist outside of time. Clara dozed fitfully in the saddle, waking periodically to check on the babies or to marvel at the vast canopy of stars overhead. She had never seen so many stars, had never realized how small and large the world could feel at the same time. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, they reached a high meadow surrounded by aspen groves that whispered secrets in the morning breeze. Here Shaitan called a halt, and the weary travelers began the process of making camp in their new temporary home. Clara dismounted carefully, her body still tender from childbirth and the long night's ride. As she stood in the mountain meadow, breathing air so clean it seemed to wash her lungs with each breath, she realized that she was no longer the woman who had left Missouri with dreams of California. That woman had died in the desert, along with her illusions about the world and her place in it. The woman who stood here now holding twin sons born under desperate stars was someone new, someone whose story was just beginning to unfold in ways she never could have imagined. Behind her lay a trail of choices and chances that had brought her to this moment. Ahead lay a future that would require courage she wasn't sure she possessed, but which these people seemed convinced she already carried within her. As the sun climbed higher, warming the meadow and awakening the wildflowers that carpeted the ground, Clara understood that she had crossed more than just physical distance in the past few days. She had crossed from one life into another, from one understanding of herself into something altogether different and infinitely more complex. The question now was not whether she could survive what lay ahead, but who she would choose to become in the process of surviving it. The mountain meadow that had seemed like sanctuary at dawn revealed its true nature as the days passed, a temporary refuge perched on the edge of wilderness so vast it seemed to swallow hope itself. Clara learned to read the signs that spoke of approaching danger long before her eyes could see it. The way Chatan's shoulders would tense when he studied the southern horizon, the hushed conversations between the warriors that stopped abruptly when she approached the careful rationing of supplies that suggested a longer journey than anyone wanted to admit. It was on their 5th morning in the high country that the signs became impossible to ignore. Clara was learning to weave grass into baskets under Camila's patient instruction, the babies sleeping peacefully in the cradleboard beside her when a young scout came racing into camp on a lathered horse. His arrival sent ripples of tension through the peaceful morning routine like a stone thrown into still water. "Soldiers," he reported breathlessly to the circle of elders who had gathered around him. "Many soldiers, coming fast from 3 directions." Clara's hand stilled on the half-finished basket as the implications sank in. The army hadn't simply returned to their abandoned village, they had committed serious resources to tracking down the band, bringing enough men to surround and capture them in the mountains. "How many?" Chatan asked, his voice steady, but his eyes already calculating distances and escape routes. "More than we have bullets for," the scout replied grimly. "And they have the Crow with them. Trackers who know this country as well as we do." Clara felt the blood drain from her face as she understood what this meant. The military had enlisted tribal allies, turning Indian against Indian in their pursuit. Any advantage the band might have had from superior knowledge of the terrain had just evaporated. A pony approached the circle with the measured pace of someone who had faced impossible situations before and survived them through wisdom rather than panic. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of a woman who had guided her people through decades of hardship. "How much time?" she asked the scout. "Half a day, maybe less. They are pushing hard, changing horses at relay stations." The old medicine woman nodded slowly, her eyes distant as she performed calculations that went beyond simple mathematics. Clara watched her face, seeing decades of accumulated experience being brought to bear on their desperate situation. "We cannot outrun them," a pony said finally. "Not with children and elders, not through country. They know as well as we do now." "Then we fight," said one of the younger warriors, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. "Fight with what?" Chatan asked harshly. 12 rifles against 50 old men and nursing mothers against cavalry troopers. That is not fighting, that is dying, with extra steps. Clara found herself standing, the babies stirring in response to the tension in her voice. "There's another way," she said quietly, and every eye in the circle turned to her. "They're not really hunting your people. They're hunting me." The silence that followed her words stretched like a bowstring drawn too tight. Clara could see understanding dawning in their faces, could watch them reach the same terrible conclusion that had been growing in her mind since the scout's arrival. "No," Kimela said firmly, rising to stand beside Clara. "We do not abandon family to wolves." "I'm not your family," Clara replied gently. "I'm a white woman who stumbled into your lives carrying trouble I didn't understand. If I surrender myself, if you surrender yourself, they will still attack." Chatan interrupted. "They have come too far, invested too much pride in this hunt. Your capture would only be the beginning." Aponi raised her hand for silence, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. "The spirits brought her to us for a reason. That reason has not yet been fulfilled." "What reason could justify risking everyone's lives?" Clara asked desperately. "Perhaps the reason is learning," Aponi replied cryptically. "Learning that some things are worth the risk." Before Clara could ask what she meant, another commotion erupted at the edge of camp. This time it wasn't a scout bringing news, but a group of travelers approaching from the west, a small band of riders moving with the easy confidence of people who belonged to this harsh landscape. Clara watched as the strangers drew closer, her heart lifting as she recognized the distinctive dress and bearing of another tribal group. But her relief was short-lived as she saw the weapons they carried and the grim expressions on their faces. "Cheyenne," Chatan said quietly, recognition in his voice. "But not friends, I think." The leader of the approaching band was a man of perhaps 40 years, his face painted for war, and his rifle held across his saddle with the casual readiness of someone accustomed to violence. When he spoke, his words were directed at Chatan, but his eyes remained fixed on Clara. "We heard the blue coats are hunting a white woman and her children," he said in accented English clearly meant for Clara's understanding. "They have promised gold for information safety for those who help them find what they seek." Clara felt the world shift beneath her feet as she realized what was happening. The army's pursuit had driven other tribal groups to choose sides, forcing them to decide between solidarity with fellow Indians and the practical advantages of cooperation with federal authority. "You would trade our people's freedom for white man's gold?" Chatan asked, his voice deadly quiet. "I would trade one woman's life for my children's safety," the Cheyenne leader replied without shame. "The blue coats say they only want her. They say once they have her, they will leave the rest of us in peace." "And you believe their promises?" Aponi asked, stepping forward with the fearless dignity of a woman who had seen too much history to be intimidated by threats. "I believe their threats," the man replied honestly. "They say any band that harbors her will be treated as hostiles. All their lands will be forfeit, all their people relocated to the reservation lands." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her like a mountain. Every option seemed to lead to suffering for herself, for her babies, for the people who had risked everything to save them. The world that had seemed to offer her redemption was collapsing around her, revealing itself as just another trap. "There is a third way," a new voice said from behind them, and Clara turned to see a figure emerging from the tree line, a white man in buckskins, his beard streaked with gray, and his eyes holding the wisdom of someone who had learned to see the world from multiple perspectives. The arrival of another white person sent fresh tension rippling through both groups. Clara could see hands moving toward weapons, could feel the delicate balance of the situation threatening to tip into violence. "I know you," Chatan said slowly, recognition dawning in his voice. "You are the traitor, the one they call Broken Rope." The man nodded, his movements careful and non-threatening as he approached the tense gathering. "Marcus Whitfield," he said, and Clara felt her heart stop at the familiar surname. "I've been tracking this situation for days, trying to understand why my nephew Silas has half the territorial army chasing shadows through Indian country." Clara stared at him, her mind reeling with the implications of this new development. Another Whitfield, but one who seemed to approach the situation with curiosity rather than hostility. In his weathered face, she could see echoes of Thomas's features, but tempered by years of experience that her late husband had never lived to gain. "You're Thomas's uncle," she said quietly, and something shifted in Marcus's expression at the sound of her voice. "And you're the woman who was supposed to have died in the desert," he replied. Silas told quite a story about Indian raids and kidnapped captives, but the Crow Scouts I talked to had a different version, something about a pregnant woman being abandoned to die and rescued by people with more honor than her own family. The Cheyenne leader looked between them with growing confusion, clearly trying to understand how this development affected his own plans. "The woman is here," he said impatiently. "The reward still stands." "What reward?" Marcus asked sharply. $500 in gold for information leading to her capture. 1,000 for bringing her in alive. Marcus's face darkened at the news, and Clara could see anger building behind his eyes, not at her, but at the system that had put a price on her head. "Silas always was a fool," he muttered, "but I didn't think he was stupid enough to start a war over his own guilt." "What do you mean?" Clara asked. "I mean my nephew knows exactly what happened to you. Knows he condemned you and those babies to death in the desert. All this noise about raids and kidnapping, it's his way of making sure his version of events becomes the official record." Clara felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, understanding the true scope of Silas's deception. By turning her rescue into a crime, he had not only justified his actions, but created a story that painted him as the victim of Indian aggression rather than the perpetrator of attempted murder. "So what do you propose?" Chetan asked, his tone suggesting he was willing to listen, but not yet convinced. "I propose we give them what they're looking for," Marcus replied, "but not in the way they expect." Before anyone could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the meadow, multiple riders moving at speed, their route suggesting they had spotted the camp and were closing in fast. The time for discussion had run out, and Clara found herself at the center of a convergence that could easily explode into violence. "Decisions," a pony said urgently. "Now we make decisions." The Cheyenne leader raised his rifle, his intentions clear, but before he could act, Chetan stepped between him and Clara, his own weapon appearing with fluid grace. The two men faced each other across a distance measured in heartbeats and harsh breathing, while around them the camp erupted into the controlled chaos of people preparing for battle. "You would die for a white woman?" the Cheyenne asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "I would die for family," Chetan replied simply. "Color has nothing to do with it." Clara looked around at the people who had risked everything for her. A pony gathering her medicine bundles, Camilla clutching her own baby while keeping protective eyes on Clara's twins warriors checking their weapons with the calm efficiency of men who had faced death before. These people who owed her nothing were preparing to fight for her life. The approaching soldiers were close enough now that individual voices could be distinguished, close enough that the jingle of harnesses and the creak of leather carried clearly in the thin mountain air. Clara made her decision with the same desperate clarity that had helped her survive childbirth in the desert. "I'm going to surrender," she announced, stepping away from Chetan's protection before anyone could stop her. "Clara, no," Camilla pleaded, but Clara was already moving toward the edge of camp, her hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender. "If I go willingly, maybe they'll leave the rest of you alone," she called back over her shoulder. "Maybe this ends here." She had taken perhaps a dozen steps when the first soldier appeared through the trees, the same lieutenant who had searched their lodge days earlier, his young face now marked with the strain of hard travel and frustrated pursuit. Behind him came his sergeant and a column of cavalry troopers, their rifles ready and their eyes scanning for threats. "There she is," the sergeant said with satisfaction. just like the Indian said. Clara felt her heart sink as she realized the Cheyenne had already provided information to the army, had helped guide them to this confrontation. The web of alliances and betrayals was more complex than she had understood, and her gesture of surrender might accomplish nothing more than ensuring her own capture. "Clara Whitfield," the lieutenant called out, his voice carrying across the meadow with official authority. "By order of the territorial government, you are to be taken into protective custody pending investigation of crimes committed against you." Protective custody. The phrase would have been laughable if the situation weren't so deadly. Clara could see the soldiers positioning themselves to surround the camp, could watch the careful choreography of a military operation designed to eliminate any possibility of escape. "I'm here," she replied, continuing to walk toward the soldiers with her hands raised. "I'll come willingly. Just leave these people alone." "That depends on them," the lieutenant replied. "Any resistance will be met with appropriate force." Clara was halfway to the soldiers when Marcus Whitfield stepped out of the trees, positioning himself directly in the path between Clara and the advancing cavalry. His appearance clearly surprised the lieutenant, who hadn't expected to encounter another white civilian in this remote location. "Stand aside, sir," the lieutenant ordered. "This is military business." "This is family business," Marcus replied calmly. "And I'm family." Clara watched the exchange with growing tension, realizing that Marcus's intervention might be about to complicate an already dangerous situation. Behind her, she could sense the tribal warriors taking positions, preparing for a fight that could erupt at any moment. "I said stand aside," the lieutenant repeated, his hand moving to his sidearm. "And I said, this is family business," Marcus replied with the patient tone of a man explaining obvious facts to a slow child. "That woman is my nephew's widow. Those babies are my blood kin, and I'll be damned if I let you arrest her for the crime of surviving my nephew's attempt to murder her." The words hit the meadow like a thunderclap, freezing everyone in place as the implications sank in. Clara stared at Marcus in shock, realizing that he had just publicly accused his own family member of attempted murder in front of federal soldiers. "That's a serious allegation," the lieutenant said carefully. "It's a serious crime," Marcus replied. "Silas Whitfield abandoned a pregnant woman in the desert to die, then reported her as kidnapped when she had the audacity to survive. Now he's got the army chasing shadows to cover up his own guilt." Clara could see uncertainty creeping into the lieutenant's face as he tried to process this new information. The neat narrative he'd been given, white woman kidnapped by hostile Indians, was suddenly complicated by family accusations and competing versions of events. "We have orders to bring her in," the sergeant said, his voice suggesting he cared more about following commands than understanding complex family dynamics. "And I have legal authority as next of kin to object to her detention," Marcus replied smoothly. "Unless you have actual evidence of a crime rather than the word of a man who might have committed attempted murder." The standoff stretched across the meadow, with armed men on multiple sides trying to decide whether words or weapons would resolve the situation. Clara found herself at the center of it all, holding babies who represented the future, while powerful men argued about the past. It was a pony who broke the deadlock, walking forward with the fearless dignity of a woman who had faced down threats far greater than a confused cavalry lieutenant. When she spoke, her words were in English, careful and precise, meant for everyone to understand. "This woman came to us dying," she said simply. "We healed her, fed her babies, gave her shelter when her own people cast her away. Now you come with guns and gold, wanting to take her back to those who tried to kill her. What justice is this?" The lieutenant looked around the meadow, taking in the faces surrounding him. Tribal elders watching with ancient eyes, warriors ready to fight for principles. He was only beginning to understand. Women protecting children who might become orphans before the day was done. Clara could see him struggling with the gap between his orders and the reality of what he was being asked to do. "I need to speak with my commanding officer," he said finally. This situation is more complicated than I was briefed to expect. Good, Marcus said with satisfaction, because there's something else you need to know. Those Crow Scouts who've been guiding you, they've been playing both sides of this game, taking army gold, while feeding information to the tribes they're supposed to be hunting. Half of what you think you know about this situation is deliberately false. Clara watched the lieutenant's face pale as he realized the scope of the deception surrounding him. Not only were his orders based on false information, but his very sources of intelligence were compromised. He was a young officer trying to do his duty, but that duty had been corrupted by lies and competing agendas. "Stand down," he ordered his men, his voice heavy with the weight of difficult decisions. "We're withdrawing to await further orders." The relief that swept through the camp was almost palpable, but Clara knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The fundamental conflicts that had brought them to this point hadn't been resolved, merely postponed. Somewhere in a territorial capital, decisions were being made that would affect all their lives, and they had no control over the outcome. As the soldiers began their withdrawal, the Cheyenne leader approached Marcus with obvious frustration. "What about the reward? What about our agreement with the army? What about your honor?" Marcus replied sharply. "What about the obligation to protect women and children regardless of their skin color? When did survival become more important than the values that make survival worthwhile?" The Cheyenne's face darkened at the rebuke, but before he could respond, one of his own men spoke up, a younger warrior whose eyes held the fire of someone who still believed in ideals. "The traitor speaks truth," the young man said in careful English. "We have become what we once fought against, people who trade honor for convenience." Clara watched the internal struggle playing out within the Cheyenne band, seeing the same conflicts that were tearing apart the larger world reflected in microcosm. Progress versus tradition, survival versus principle, cooperation versus resistance. These were the choices that defined an entire era, and there were no easy answers. As the afternoon wore on and the various groups sorted themselves out, Clara found herself sitting by a small stream that meandered through the meadow, nursing her babies and trying to process everything that had happened. The water sang softly over smooth stones, a peaceful sound that seemed to belong to a different world than the one where armed men argued over her fate. Chatan approached and settled beside her, his presence offering comfort without demanding conversation. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the babies and listening to the water's gentle music. "What happens now?" Clara asked finally. "Now we wait," Chatan replied. "Wait and see what stories powerful men decide to tell about today. And if they decide to tell stories that condemn us all." Chatan was quiet for a moment, his eyes following the path of a red-tailed hawk circling high overhead. "Then we learn whether the spirits have more plans for us, or whether this is where our particular story ends." Clara followed his gaze to the circling hawk, thinking about the ancient patterns of predator and prey, of survival and sacrifice that governed all life in these mountains. She had been prey in the desert, saved by predators who turned out to be protectors. Now she was something else, a catalyst for changes she couldn't predict or control. "I keep thinking about that moment in the desert," she said quietly, "when I thought we were all going to die, when everything seemed hopeless. It feels like I've been living in that moment ever since, just with more people involved." "Maybe," Chatan agreed. "Or maybe that moment in the desert was when you stopped being who you were and started becoming who you are meant to be." Clara considered his words as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the meadow in shades of gold and amber. Around them, the camp was settling into an uneasy evening routine, with families preparing food and children playing games that mimicked the serious business of survival. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new tests of the fragile alliances that had formed around her rescue. But tonight, for a few precious hours, there was peace in the high meadow. Tonight, her babies were safe and fed and warm, surrounded by people who had chosen to see them as family rather than strangers. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Clara made her own choice about the story she wanted to tell. Not the story of a victim rescued from the desert, but the story of a woman who had learned that family was something you built rather than something you were born into. Not the story of white against Indian, but the story of people who had discovered that courage and compassion could transcend the artificial divisions that kept communities apart. The future remained uncertain, balanced on the edge of decisions being made in distant places by people who would never understand the full complexity of what they were judging. But the present, this moment of peace under the vast canopy of stars, belonged to them. And for now, that was enough. The peace of that starlit evening shattered with the dawn, bringing news that would test every alliance forged in the crucible of survival. Clara woke to the sound of urgent voices and running feet, the kind of commotion that spoke of crisis arriving on swift horses. Through the lodge entrance, she could see Marcus Whitfield speaking rapidly with Chatan and the other elders, his weathered face grim with whatever intelligence he'd received. "What is it?" Clara asked, emerging from the lodge with both babies secured against her chest in the cradleboard that had become as natural to her as breathing. Marcus turned toward her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. Not fear, but the kind of resigned determination that came with facing inevitable confrontation. "Silas is coming," he said simply, "with a federal marshal and enough backing to make this official. They're calling it a rescue operation, but they're bringing enough firepower to end a small war." Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet as the implications crashed over her like a winter avalanche. All their careful maneuvering, all the temporary safety they'd won through words and wisdom, it was about to be swept away by the implacable machinery of territorial law. "How long do we have?" Chatan asked, his voice carrying the calm of a man who had faced impossible odds before. "Hours, not days," Marcus replied. They pushed through the night, changing horses at relay stations. Whatever strings Silas pulled to arrange this, they reach all the way to the territorial capital. A pony approached the group with the measured pace of someone conserving energy for the trials ahead. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of prophecy mixed with practical wisdom. "The spirits have been preparing us for this moment," she said quietly. "All the choices we have made, all the paths we have walked, they lead to this place, this time." Clara looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing a mixture of determination and resignation that spoke of people who had reached the end of running. The Cheyenne band had withdrawn during the night, taking their internal conflicts elsewhere, but the core group remained Chatan's people, bonded together by shared struggle and mutual protection. "There's still time to run," Clara said desperately. "If you scatter now, take different paths." "Run where?" Kimala interrupted, gently shifting her own baby to reach out and touch Clara's arm. "This is our land. These are our sacred places. How far do we run before there is nowhere left to go?" The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a dying fire, carrying with it the accumulated weight of decades of displacement and loss. Clara realized that for these people this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about drawing a line and saying that some things were worth standing for, regardless of the cost. "Besides," Marcus added with a grim smile, "I've got my own business with Silas. Been 30 years since someone needed to explain to him the difference between justice and revenge." Before Clara could ask what he meant, another rider appeared at the edge of the meadow. Not a scout this time, but a young Lakota warrior she didn't recognize. His horse lathered with the sweat of hard travel, and his face painted for war. He spoke rapidly to Chatan in their own language, his words urgent and his gestures sweeping toward the southern approaches to the meadow. Clara caught enough familiar words to understand that he was reporting movement, multiple groups converging on their position from different directions. "What is he saying?" she asked. "He says the federal marshal has split his forces," Chatan translated grimly, "coming from 3 directions to prevent escape. And—" he paused, his expression darkening. And he says there are others coming from the north. Soldiers, but not the same uniform. Marcus cursed under his breath, a sound that carried years of frustration and accumulated anger. Territorial militia, he said. Silas must have convinced the governor that this is about more than one woman, that it's about Indian uprising, about protecting white settlements. Clara felt sick as she understood the scope of what was unfolding. Her survival, her rescue, her very existence had been transformed into a casus belli, a justification for the kind of military action that could devastate tribal communities across the territory. How many? Aponi asked the messenger. The young warrior held up both hands, then repeated the gesture twice more. 60 men minimum, armed and organized and approaching with the methodical precision of a military operation designed to leave no avenue of escape. We can't fight that many, one of the tribal elders said quietly. Not and protect the children. Then we don't fight, Chetan replied with sudden decision. We do something else. Before anyone could ask what he meant, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the mountains. Single shots spaced apart, the kind of measured firing that spoke of signals rather than battle. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized the various military groups were coordinating their approach, timing their movements to close all possible escape routes simultaneously. The sacred spring, Aponi said suddenly, her ancient eyes bright with sudden inspiration. We go to the sacred spring. Clara saw understanding pass between the tribal members like lightning jumping between storm clouds. Whatever Aponi was proposing, it carried significance that went beyond simple geography. What sacred spring? Marcus asked, voicing Clara's own confusion. 1/4 mile north of here, Chetan explained rapidly. Hidden canyon, narrow entrance, sacred to our people for generations, place where spirits speak directly to those who know how to listen. More importantly, Aponi added with the practicality that made her such an effective leader, place where we can defend ourselves if we must, but also place where even territorial militia will hesitate to spill blood. Clara didn't fully understand the cultural implications, but she could see the hope kindling in the faces around her. A defensible position was one thing, but a place that carried spiritual significance might provide protection of a different kind altogether. The movement to the spring was conducted with the kind of organized efficiency that spoke of a people accustomed to relocating under pressure. Within minutes, the camp had been reduced to essential supplies, the horses loaded with children and elders, and the entire group moving through terrain that seemed to exist on the edge of the world itself. Clara found herself riding beside Marcus, their horses picking their way along a trail that was barely visible to her untrained eyes. The babies rode peacefully in their cradleboard, lulled by the rhythm of movement, and seemingly unaware that their young lives hung in the balance of decisions being made by powerful men they would never meet. "Why are you helping us?" Clara asked quietly, finally voicing the question that had been growing in her mind since Marcus's unexpected appearance. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, as if seeing not just the immediate terrain, but the accumulated weight of years and choices. "Because Silas killed my brother just as surely as if he'd put a gun to his head," he said finally. "Thomas was always the best of us kind, where we were hard, generous where we were grasping. When he married, you chose to leave the family business behind and try to build something better. That took courage. Silas never understood." Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes at the mention of Thomas, her husband's memory still sharp enough to cut despite everything that had happened since his death. "Thomas talked about you," she said softly. "Said you were the one person in the family who understood why he wanted to leave Missouri, why he dreamed of California." "Dreams are dangerous things in my family," Marcus replied with bitter humor. "We've built our fortune on being practical, on taking what we can get, rather than reaching for what we want. Thomas threatened that philosophy just by existing. The trail they were following began to descend into a narrow canyon, its walls rising on either side like the ribs of some ancient creature. Clara could hear the sound of running water ahead growing stronger as they moved deeper into the hidden landscape. "And when he died," Clara asked. "When he died, Silas saw an opportunity to clean up what he considered a family embarrassment, get rid of the inconvenient widow, eliminate any claim you or your children might have on the Whitfield name." Marcus's voice hardened with controlled anger. "He thought the desert would bury his mistakes along with your bones." The sacred spring revealed itself, gradually emerging from the canyon walls like something from a dream. Water bubbled up from hidden sources, forming a pool so clear it seemed to reflect not just the sky above, but something deeper and more eternal. Around the water's edge, generations of tribal visitors had left offerings, stones arranged in careful patterns, feathers tied to overhanging branches, small bundles of sage and sweetgrass that filled the air with their sacred scent. "Beautiful," Clara whispered, awed by the sense of timeless peace that seemed to emanate from the place. "Sacred," Aponi corrected gently. "Place where the barrier between worlds grows thin, where spirits of the ancestors can touch the lives of their children." The group settled around the spring with the kind of reverent efficiency that spoke of people who understood they were in a holy place. Even the children seemed to sense the significance of their surroundings, their usual chatter subdued to whispers that seemed to blend with the gentle sound of flowing water. It was here, in this sanctuary carved from living stone and blessed by countless generations of prayer, that Clara's transformation finally reached its culmination. As she knelt beside the sacred waters to bathe her babies, feeling the warm stone beneath her knees and the cool mist on her face, she felt the last remnants of her old identity falling away like old skin. The woman who had left Missouri with dreams of orange groves was gone, replaced by someone harder and more complex, but also more complete. The woman who had nearly died in the desert was gone too, along with the desperate creature who had clutched at survival without understanding its true cost. What remained was something new, a mother who had learned that love could transcend the artificial boundaries between peoples, a survivor who had discovered that strength came not from standing alone, but from choosing who to stand with. "They're coming," Chaitan announced quietly, positioned at the canyon's narrow entrance where he could watch the approaches. "All three groups converging now, maybe 10 minutes before they reach us." Clara nodded, surprising herself with how calm she felt in the face of what might be her final crisis. Around the spring, the tribal members were making their own preparations, not for battle, though weapons were checked and readied, but for something that seemed to reach deeper than mere physical confrontation. Aponi approached with a small bundle wrapped in soft doeskin, her movements ceremonial in their careful precision. "Time for the naming," she said simply. Clara looked at her in confusion. "Naming? Your sons have lived as Lakota for many days now," the old woman explained. "They have drunk our milk, slept under our protection, been carried on our horses through sacred places. If they are to be our family truly, they need names that reflect their place in our world." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. With enemy forces closing in from 3 directions and their lives hanging by threads that could snap at any moment, the tribal community took time to welcome her children formally into their extended family. Aponi dipped her fingers in the sacred spring and touched each baby's forehead while speaking words in Lakota that seemed to carry the weight of ancient blessing. Other members of the group came forward with small gifts, a tiny bow carved from mountain ash eagle feathers, blessed by generations of use beads that caught the light like captured stars. "This one," Aponi said, lifting Ethan toward the sky, "will be called Wanbli Waste Good Eagle, he who soars above troubles and sees clearly from great heights." She turned to Jonah, cradling him with the gentleness of a woman who had blessed countless children in her long life. "This one will be called Wikapi Nejin Rising Star, he who brings light to dark places and guides lost travelers home." Clara felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she understood what was happening. In the face of almost certain disaster, these people were claiming her sons as their own, giving them names and identity that would survive even if everything else was lost. And you, Aponi continued, turning to Clara with eyes that seemed to hold the accumulated wisdom of centuries. You are no longer the woman who was cast into the desert to die. You are Wakinhin Najin woman who prays standing, she who finds strength in the storm and teaches others that survival is not enough, we must also learn to live. The sound of approaching horses interrupted the sacred moment, their hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls with the finality of thunder. Clara rose to her feet, feeling the weight of her new identity settling around her shoulders like a ceremonial robe. At the canyon's entrance, she could see figures in blue uniforms dismounting, their movements careful but determined. Among them she recognized the federal marshal, a lean man with gray hair and the kind of face that spoke of years spent enforcing unpopular laws in difficult places. But it was the figure beside him that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. Silas Whitfield had aged in the weeks since she'd seen him last, his face gaunt with what might have been grief or guilt or simply the exhaustion of maintaining lies too complex to remember easily. When his eyes found hers across the distance, she saw something flicker in their depths, surprise perhaps that she was still alive, or recognition that his careful plans had gone badly awry. "Clara Whitfield," the marshal called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls with official authority. "I'm Deputy Marshal Williams. I'm here to take you into protective custody and return you to your family." Clara stepped forward, moving with the kind of fluid grace she'd learned from watching Lakota women move through their world with perfect confidence. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air, reaching every person gathered around the sacred spring. "My name is Wakinhin Najin," she said clearly, "and my family is here." She gestured toward the group behind her, Chatan, with his weathered face and gentle hands, Camila holding both babies with the fierce protectiveness of a sister Aponi, standing straight and proud despite her advanced years. Marcus with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on his nephew with decades of accumulated disappointment. The marshal looked confused by her response, clearly unprepared for a kidnapping victim who refused to acknowledge her rescue. "Ma'am, I understand you may have developed sympathies for your captors, but—" "Captors?" Clara interrupted, and something in her voice made several of the soldiers shift uncomfortably. "These people saved my life when my own family left me to die in the desert. They fed my children when I had no milk, protected us when we had no strength to protect ourselves, welcomed us into their homes when we had nowhere else to go. If that's captivity, then I choose to remain captive." Silas stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and what Clara now recognized as fear. "Don't listen to her lies," he said harshly. "She's been brainwashed, turned against her own people. Those children are Whitfield heirs. They belong with their family." "Their family is here," Clara replied firmly, "with people who chose to love them instead of abandoning them to die." The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Clara could have imagined when she'd first been cast into the desert months ago. Here, beside waters that had been sacred for countless generations, representatives of two worlds faced each other across a divide that seemed to encompass far more than simple legal jurisdiction. The marshal found himself caught between his clear orders and the obvious complexity of a situation that defied easy resolution. Clara wasn't acting like a victim, she was acting like a woman who had found her place in the world and was prepared to defend it. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said carefully, "I have a federal warrant for your return. Regardless of your feelings about these people, the law requires justice." Marcus interrupted, stepping forward with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of successful business negotiations. "And there's been precious little of that in this situation." The marshal turned toward Marcus with obvious relief, at encountering another white man in the complex equation. And you are Marcus Whitfield, Clara's uncle by marriage and the person with actual legal standing to speak for her interests. Marcus pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. This is a formal complaint filed with the Territorial Attorney General alleging attempted murder against my nephew Silas. The paper Marcus handed over seemed to carry more weight than its physical substance suggested. Clara watched the marshal's face change. As he read, saw official certainty giving way to bureaucratic caution. "These are serious allegations," the marshal said slowly. "They're serious crimes," Marcus replied. "Abandoning a pregnant woman in the desert constitutes attempted murder under territorial law. Everything that happened afterward, her rescue, her recovery, her integration into this community, flows directly from that original crime." Silas's face had gone pale during this exchange, and when he spoke, his voice carried a desperate edge that Clara had never heard before. "She's my son's widow, my grandchildren's mother. I have every right. You have no rights over people you tried to kill," Clara interrupted, and her voice carried across the canyon with the kind of absolute conviction that cut through legal complexity like a blade through silk. "You forfeited those rights when you unhitched my horse and drove away, leaving me and your own grandchildren to die in the wilderness." The silence that followed her words stretched across the sacred space like a held breath. Clara could see the soldiers looking between their officers and each other, clearly uncomfortable with a situation that had moved far beyond simple arrest procedures. It was a pony who broke the deadlock, approaching the group of officials with the fearless dignity of a woman who had faced down threats far greater than federal marshals. When she spoke, her words were in careful English meant for everyone to understand. "In the old days, when disputes arose between peoples, we would come to places like this to seek wisdom from the spirits," she said, her voice carrying the authority of vast experience. "The water here has been sacred since before memory, blessed by the prayers of countless generations. It is fitting that important decisions should be made in such a place." The marshal looked around the canyon, taking in the offerings left by generations of pilgrims, the sense of timeless peace that seemed to emanate from the very stones. Clara could see him struggling with the gap between his modern bureaucratic authority and the ancient spiritual power of the place. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting," he said carefully. "I'm suggesting that sometimes the spirits provide solutions that human wisdom cannot reach," a pony replied. "Sometimes the answer to impossible problems lies not in choosing sides, but in finding a third way that honors all truths." Before the marshal could respond, Shaitan stepped forward, and Clara was amazed to see him carrying not weapons, but something far more powerful, a pipe carved from red stone and decorated with eagle feathers that seemed to catch and hold the morning light. "We smoke," he said simply, "all of us together. We listen to what the spirits have to say about this situation before we decide who lives and who dies." The request was so unexpected, so far outside the normal protocols of federal law enforcement, that Clara could see the marshal struggling to process it. But there was something in the sacred atmosphere of the place, something in the accumulated dignity of the people gathered around the spring that made simple refusal seem not just wrong, but somehow impossible. "This is highly irregular," the marshal said finally. "So is the entire situation," Marcus pointed out dryly. "We're past regular procedures here." What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary scene in the history of territorial law enforcement. A federal marshal, a accused family patriarch, a diverse collection of tribal elders, and a woman who had died and been reborn in the desert, all sitting in a circle around a sacred spring, while tobacco smoke carried their unspoken prayers toward the sky. Clara found herself between Shaitan and Marcus, holding her babies and watching smoke rise in the thin mountain air. The ceremony was conducted in multiple languages, Lakota English, and something deeper that seemed to transcend words altogether. As the pipe passed from hand to hand, she felt something shifting in the very air around them, as if the canyon itself was listening and weighing the claims of justice being made within its walls. When the smoking was complete and the pipe had been reverently put away, the marshal sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. When his words finally came, they carried a weight of decision that seemed to arise from somewhere deeper than mere legal authority. "This is what's going to happen," he said slowly. "Mrs. Whitfield will return with us to the territorial capital, where she will give formal testimony about the events surrounding her husband's death and her subsequent experiences. Mr. Silas Whitfield will also testify under oath about his version of those same events." Clara felt her heart sink, thinking that all their struggles had led only to a more formal version of the same injustice. But the marshal wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "given the unusual circumstances of this case and the obvious complexity of the family dynamics involved, Mrs. Whitfield will be accompanied by representatives of her choosing, including legal counsel provided by Mr. Marcus Whitfield, and cultural advisors from the tribal community that has cared for her." Silas started to object, but the marshal cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Furthermore, pending the outcome of the territorial investigation, the children will remain in the custody of their mother and her chosen guardians. Any attempt to interfere with that arrangement will be considered obstruction of a federal investigation." Clara felt tears of relief streaming down her cheeks as she understood what the marshal was offering. Not perfect justice, perhaps, but something far better than she had dared to hope for. A chance to tell her story in a place where it might actually be heard, with people she trusted standing beside her. As the various groups prepared to leave the sacred canyon, Clara took one last moment beside the spring that had witnessed her final transformation. She knelt at the water's edge, dipping her fingers in the sacred flow and touching each baby's forehead in imitation of a pony's blessing. "Wanblee waste," she whispered to Ethan. "Soar high and see clearly." "Wikapi Najin," she murmured to Jonah. "Light the way for those who are lost." Behind her, she could hear the sounds of a complex journey beginning, horses being loaded, supplies being distributed, people from different worlds learning to travel together toward an uncertain but hopeful future. The territorial capital would bring new challenges, new tests of the bonds that had been forged in the crucible of survival. But as Clara rose to join the group that had become her chosen family, she carried with her something that no court proceeding could diminish: the knowledge that love and courage could transcend the artificial boundaries that divided communities. That family was something you built, rather than something you inherited, and that sometimes the greatest victories came not from feeding your enemies, but from choosing who you wanted to become in the face of impossible circumstances. The woman who had been cast into the desert to die was gone forever, replaced by someone who had learned that survival was just the beginning of a much larger story. As they rode out of the sacred canyon toward whatever trials awaited them, Clara carried her sons and her new identity with equal pride, ready to face whatever came next, with people who had chosen to stand with her when standing alone would have been so much easier. The desert had taken everything she thought she wanted and given her everything she actually needed. Now it was time to see what the wider world would make of the woman she had become in its crucible of sand and stars and second chances.